Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here today, and thank you for the invitation, and thank you for a great talk. It's going to be interesting to think about voices and echoes of sound in relation. In 2018, I was working at the Gnazim archives and exploring earlier drafts of Leah Goldberg's novel, Letters from an Imagined Journey, that was published in 1936. In this novel, Goldberg, a well-known poet, author, quotes German poetry in its original German, celebrated poets like Erich Kästner and Rainer Maria Rilke. As I was examining these early manuscripts, I discovered a quote by a German poem I did not recognize, one that had not made it to the published version. The author's name was missing. But I knew that when Goldberg quotes poetry, it's worthwhile following her lead. It's bound to be something valuable. So with Goldberg as my guide, I discovered Mascha, Kaléko, a Jewish poet from Berlin who fled the Nazis to New York and later to Israel, here in Jerusalem, and whose poetry grapples with challenges of the questions of home, the very same questions that we are exploring throughout our two-day gathering, and offering insights on vocal remains as a marker of a home at the time of migration against realities of war. So maybe in this room, Kaléko is very well known, but strikingly, at the Buber Society of Fellows, for example, we're half Israelis, half Germans, typically, and most of the time, all of the Germans know her, and none of the Israelis do, because, and the same as me, right? And even though she lived here in Jerusalem for 15 years. So this is the moment of discrepancy that I would kind of like to launch from. So in Germany, Kaléko's poetry can be found in every bookstore. But here in Israel, she remains unknown, despite living here in Jerusalem for roughly 15 years. Nonetheless, she continued to write in German and was frequently invited to Berlin every summer to read her poetry out loud. What does it mean, then, to perform poetry intended to be read? How does the voice of the poet dispositions the poem, and what does it mean for us to listen? So, before delving into the talk, let's listen for a moment to Kaléko's voice. So you'll see here, oh, hold on. I apologize, always working with, this is Mascha Kaléko. So you have here the English translation, but we will of course hear her voice in German.
Wohin ich immer reise, ich fahr nach Nirgendland. Die Koffer voll von Sehnsucht, die Hände voll von Tand. So einsam wie der Wüstenwind, so heimatlos wie Sand. Wohin ich immer reise, ich komm nach Nirgendland. Die Wälder sind verschwunden, die Häuser sind verbrannt. Hab keinen mehr gefunden, hat keiner mich erkannt. Und als der fremde Vogel schrie, bin ich davongerannt. Wohin ich immer reise, ich komm nach Nirgendland.
So in a way, corresponding with your talk, the word Heim doesn't appear, and yet, right, or it does, but like that, but it's not reoccurring in the sense, but we can sense it, right? Like this question of home. So in my talk today, I want to examine the vocal and performative dimensions of Kaléko's work, asking how her voice, both literal and metaphorical, interrupts at once Jewish and Israeli perceptions of German poetry, which had come since the 1940s to be associated with the language of the perpetrators. But focusing on Kaléko's recorded poetry, I ask how voice as a medium is used and circulated as a form of cultural negotiation and carry a possible or impossible home. How did she navigate between the German literary circles that celebrated her and her double migration, first from Berlin, then to New York, and then to Jerusalem, where German was forbidden on the streets and stage? What from public spheres, right? We all know that it was talked to, but mostly in private spheres, but not allowed to be performed. So what can her recorded performances as oral remains of the past, in Ruthie Abliovich's terms, can tell us about how Jewish women writers found ways to participate in public literary spheres during periods of migration and displacement? I argue that for Kaléko, the suppression of German in Jerusalem led her to develop new artistic forms, subverting dominant Jewish national narratives. By continuing to write and perform in German, she reasserted her German Jewish identity, recalibrating the relationship between written and oral literary forms, and offering new insights into reshaping Jewish transnational narratives of belonging. So in what follows, I will first explore a little bit of Kaléko's literary project and migration path, and then we'll transition into a particular audio recording, asking about its orality and the relationship between the written word and the vocal expressions, and paying particular attention also to the role of silence, right? What happens in between vocal remains, or is another vocal remain. So, Mascha Kaléko, and then we can think together maybe later also in the discussion about this instance of sound, what carries on. Okay, so, Mascha Kaléko was born Golda Malka Aufen to a Jewish family from Galicia. In 1914, when Kaléko was 7 years old, the family headed westward with the outbreak of World War I, eventually settling in Berlin. Though Yiddish was her parents' first language, Kaléko and her siblings were raised in Germany and immersed themselves in the local tongue, which became their native language. Her personal life existed with a strong Jewish framework beyond her childhood home. Both her first and second husbands were pivotal figures in the Jewish community who published, like Kaléko herself, in prominent journals. Kaléko began publishing her poetry in the late 1920s and quickly became a rising star. By the 1930s, she had become part of Berlin's vibrant literary scene, frequenting the legendary Romantisches Café alongside poets like Erich Kästner, Alfred Döblin, Else Lasker-Schüller, Bertolt Brecht, and others. With the rise of the Nazi regime, though, her Jewish identity, which was revealed, because Kaléko was not, if we're thinking of sound, it didn't sound German, but actually because a Nazi officer really liked her first book, he kind of went into finding out who that poet is, and then he realized that she was Jewish. And then her books, so they stopped the printing of her second book, and later her books were burned with many others in the famous Jewish burning of books. So in 1938, she fled to New York with her second husband, where she continued to write in German for nearly 2 decades. In 1960, she moved to Jerusalem, where she would spend her final 15 years. Linguistically isolated, yet artistically persistent. Traveling frequently to Berlin, she passed away in Zurich in 1975 and was buried in the local Jewish cemetery. Okay, so just a little bit of her. Okay. Kaléko published around 10 poetry collections, with a few others printed posthumously. In Germany, she published her debut collection, Das Lyrische Stenografenheft, and the little reading book for grown-ups, capturing everyday life in Berlin in accessible yet sophisticated verse. These early works established her core themes: displacement, migration, and the search for belonging. During her New York exile, she published additional books writing for German audiences from afar. In 1956, and we'll return to that moment later on, she visited Germany for the first time since escaping it, confessing in a letter that it was no longer her Berlin. Yet this return, quote unquote, reignited her poetic voice. And after moving to Jerusalem in 1960, she continued publishing regularly in German, demonstrating her engagement with German literary culture, even while living in linguistic isolation in Israel. So, Kaléko's poetry centers on the fundamental experiences of modern displacement, the search for belonging in an era of constant movement, the melancholy of urban life, and the bittersweet recognition that home might be perpetually out of reach. You can think about it in relation to today, of course. Her work was identified with the modernist movement of Neue Sachlichkeit, characterized by everyday language and distinctive musicality. Her poetry captured, or tried to capture, a particular Berliner atmosphere, a Berliner sound, and was at once praised and critiqued for its simple register. For example, in her poem, Recipe, she writes, "Don't say, it's mine. Everything is borrowed to you. Live on borrowed time and see how little you need. Settle down and pack a suitcase." Her signature metaphor, the suitcase that is always already packed, expresses at once the Jewish uprootedness in the 20th century and the migrant's paradox of settling while remaining ready to leave. Her verses document the emotional geography of exile, the furnished rooms, the temporary loves, the jobs that pay the bills but never is quite satisfying. In this way, the stark contrast between rootedness and refugiehood becomes for Kaléko complementary elements existing simultaneously. Settling down in a place is only possible thanks to the suitcase in the background, always in the closet, the one that is already packed, ready for immediate movement. In 1966, as mentioned, she returned to Berlin for a visit where she realizes she could no longer find a homeland in Berlin. As she writes in a letter to her publisher, "Unfortunately, the Berlin I'm looking for no longer exists." So in 1962, as mentioned, two defining events occurred in her life. First, she wins the prestigious Fontana Prize in Germany and refuses to accept it after discovering that one of the judges was a former SS officer. It wasn't an easy decision, I would assume, as they were very poor, living in a fifth-story walk-up in New York, Lower East Side, coming, as immigrants to Israel. And yet it was an ethical decision, I assume. And secondly, she moves to Jerusalem, following her husband's work as a music researcher. But like Elsa Lasker-Schiller before her, Kaléko could not integrate into Hebrew culture, which had already established herself in the young state of Israel. Language and cultural gaps accompanied her in her everyday life, sometimes in particularly amusing ways. For example, in the beginning of her time in the city, she was really offended by the phenomenon that strangers would call her Mascha by her first name. But only after some time she realized that they weren't addressing her at all, but actually just simply asking Ma hasha'a. So thinking of sound. Which means what time is it? This moment, I suggest, points not only to a vocal confusion across languages, but also reveals the acoustic dimensions of displacement, which also takes shapes in her poems. Unlike Hebrew poets of German origins, like Natan Zach, Yehuda Amichai, Dan Pagis, Tuvia Rübner, and others, Kaléko continued to write in German, and not in Hebrew, and never transitioned to Hebrew, and remained foreign in the Israeli space. So as Shulamit Volkov and Ifat Weiss remarks, German was perceived as a forbidden language that continued to carry the sounds of Nazi Germany. So again, right, the layers of sound that a language carries across cultural spheres. But for Kaléko, like other German Jewish writers, German was the language of home, that of a literary homeland, at once lost and carried forward. Ironically, it was Germany that embraced her, while the Jewish state distanced herself from her German language, her German tongue, denying her from the ability to read out loud in her own voice. Her books were reprinted in Germany, and every summer she would travel there to read from her poetry. So, what do we make of these performed moments? What is the significance of hearing a poem in the poet's voice? And what kind of listening practices does that invite? Or, another way put, must we ask, how do we listen? Leslie Wheeler's distinction between textual voices and voice texts is particularly effective in thinking about Kaléko's performed poetry. For Wheeler, while the written poem describes estrangement, in many cases, the voice performance can create a different emotional reality through the embodied delivery of the text. So, with these concepts in mind, I want us to turn now to listening to Kaléko's poem, Re-Encounter with Berlin, and then we'll continue to think about it. So this is her, just so you can see. Okay. Okay. So we'll listen to it in two parts, though.
Bonjour, Berlin. Berlin im März. Die erste Deutschlandreise, seit man vor 18 Jahren mich verbannt. Ich sehe die Stadt auf eine neue Weise, so mit dem Fremdenführer in der Hand. Der Himmel blaut, die Föhren rauschen leise. In Steglitz sprach mich gestern eine Meise am Schlosspark an. Die hatte mich erkannt.
Well, finish it, Linus. So Recounter with Berlin, or it's the stanza, which, by the way, when you were talking earlier about home in Hebrew and house and bait, so I just want to mention that bait is also a stanza and a poem in Hebrew. So kind of thinking about house, home, and stanza, the way that language is, kind of bring it back together. And here it's particularly effective to think about it as like also the poem as a place of home. So Recounter with Berlin ostensibly describes a homecoming entangled with estrangement. To understand the relationship between the written text and the oral transmission, let's begin with unpacking some of the themes and imagery within the poem itself. So the title, Recounter with Berlin, sets up an expectation of reconnection. But the poem quickly reveals the alienation of the experience, needing a tourist guide, being unrecognized, except by a small bird, a tit. Wiedersehen also translates to a reunion, or seeing once again, right? Seeing again. But in this poem, the speaker experiences a re-encounter with Berlin, suggesting that through the preposition with, an attribution of character to the city space. The poem's climatic moment occurs when a tit, right, and Stieglitz recognizes the speaker. A recognition both moving and deeply ironic. In contrast to Kaléko, who was forced to leave Berlin, the tit, as a non-migratory bird, typically remains within its territory year-long and over the years. So even young tits disperse only short distances from their parents' domain, from the home, right, from the actual home. If for Hebrew poets like Chaim Nachman Bialik, Leah Goldberg, or Tuvia Ribner, the bird symbolizes at once the possibility to travel, right, Shalom Rov Shuvech, Tzipora Nechmedet, or the impossibility of fully belong, then in Kaléko's imagery, the bird stays put and recognizes the woman who was exiled, the Berliner Jew of the past. This encounter reveals the fundamental inversion of Kaléko's relationship to home. She, who once belonged to this landscape, or was part of it, now requires recognition from its smallest, most sedentary inhabitant. The tit's recognition becomes a form of testimony, not only witnessing, but remembering her presence in a city that otherwise completely forgotten her existence. So now we'll continue to the next section of the poem. Oh, I don't have it here, but you will listen to it. Okay, yeah, because I want you now to listen. Okay. So now I want us to listen without the words, so we can practice what does it mean to listen without seeing, right?
Und wieder wecken mich.
Hold on. And I'll start with this, and then we'll go straight to the last section.
Berliner Spatzen. Ich liebe diesen Märkisch-Kesselton. Höre ich sie morgens an mein Fenster kratzen. Am Kuhdamm in der Gartenhauspension komme ich sogleich, nach alter Tradition, ganz so wie damals, mit besagten Spatzen mein kleines Tagespensum durchzuschwatzen. Es ostert schon. Grün treibt die Zimmerlinde, wie es heute in Grunewald nach Frühjahr roch. Ein erster Specht beklopft die Birkenrinde. Nun pfeift der Ostwind auf dem letzten Loch und alles fragt, wie ich Berlin denn finde. Wie ich es finde? Ach, ich suche es noch. Ich suche es heftig unter den Ruinen der Menschheit und der Stuckarchitektur. Berlin hat einer, ich begrüße Ihnen, glaub ich mich fast dem damals auf der Spur.
Okay, now we'll go straight to the end. Okay. This is the last 15 seconds.
Beide unsere Medizin. Vom Pehi, ohne Pomp. Bonjour, Berlin.
So while listening to Kaléko's recording, two stark differences appear between the written text and the spoken text. First, in the recording, Kaléko begins with the words Bonjour Berlin, which do not appear in the beginning of the written text, as you can see. It appears only at the end, the final verse, which appears both in the written and spoken version. But in fact, these are the closing words of the entire poem. But in the reciting poem, Kaléko opens with this greeting, evoking the sentiment that she is indeed meeting or experiencing a re-encounter with an old friend. She does not visit Berlin. Rather, she experiences a reconnection. The second difference appears in the second verse, turning our attention once again to the separate collective and personal experiences mediated by vocal mediums. In the written text, the lyrical I returns to Berlin, quote, since they banished me 1,000 years ago. In the spoken version, however, Kaléko replaces the metaphorical 1,000 years with a concrete 18 years, echoing her arrival to Berlin in 1956, after fleeing in 1938. I have yet to found the earlier, like the drafts. I haven't worked yet with the manuscripts of this poem. It's in Kaléko's archives in Marbach, which I hope to get to later this year. So it's possible that, that these are results of earlier drafts, but it's also a possibility that it's an improvisation, right? Like often happens when we address audiences and when poets read from their poems out loud. So in this instance, the other possibility is that in the oral spoken sphere, Kaléko took her self-liberty to shift from mythical temporality to a more personal time of longing. What seems like a spontaneous shift or a vocal experiment reveals the power of voice, not only as a transmitter of text, but as an active participant of meaning by means of improvisation. So, and in closing, in this recording of Recounter with Berlin, Kaléko's warm and rhythmically varied vocal delivery demonstrates what Adriana Cavarero calls the voice's power to reveal embodied presence beyond linguistic meanings. Her friendly tone creates intimacy, right? It's like very bonjour, Berlin, that contradicts the written text's themes of alienation. But following Mladen Dolar's insights that voice operates as a grain, right, quote unquote, that exceeds linguistic contact, Kaléko's tonal shifts and rhythmic variations generate meaning through sound itself, not merely through the words spoken. circling back to these vocal traces as a marker or carrier of a possible or impossible home, Kaléko's voice thus operates as what we can term an active participant in meaning-making, negotiating between alienation inscribed in the text and the warmth maintained through this vocal intimacy. But in the end, right, we can look at her final poem. My most beautiful poem, I didn't write it. It rose from the depth, from the deepest depth. I silenced it, right? So this kind of brings us also to the role of silence. What happens in the gap between the written word and the speaking voice that also acknowledges the silences that exist between verses, between stanzas, or between homes? Thank you.